Right, it's recording in progress. I hope you heard that. The welcome to the Tolpola Radical History School evening sessions. Tonight, you can see on the screen there, Over the Hills to Glory, the story of the Ascott Martyrs. Carol Anderson, the chair of the Ascott Martyrs Educational Trust, is the main speaker this evening. And this is a story of 16 women who were arrested and were very harshly dealt with by the local magistrates after a period of industrial action. And I'm not going to say any more than that, because if I do, I shall spoil Carol's story. So it's great pleasure to hand over to Carol Anderson.
Thank you very much. All right, let us move on, we hope. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you this evening. I must say, I still find Zoom very strange. I'm used to standing up in front of a live audience and walking around, because I can never stand still when I talk. So I apologise, I'm probably waving my arms around now in lieu of having to sit down. Yeah, so I just thought, for those of you from kind of the nether reaches of empire, as it were, just to show you where we're talking about, where this all happened. Ascott Under Wychwood is still a small village, population not much more than 500 now. Time when the incident happened in 1873, population was 460. There are a lot more houses in the village now, so everybody's spread a lot more thinly than they used to be. But it's still a small village along the Evenlode Valley, on the back slope of the Cotswolds, basically. So up in northwest Oxfordshire. So that's where we are. And that's kind of what we are. This is just standing up on the valley side and looking across to one end of the village. It's a stringline settlement, it's a very long, thin settlement, river running along the bottom of the valley. And at the time that we're talking about, there were about 7 farms in this village. 2/3 of the population, not surprisingly, agricultural labourers. So it's a relatively quiet kind of backwater of a place. It had seen change, like everywhere else. The railway, what was known locally as the Worse and Worse, which was the Worcester Railway from Oxford on up to Worcester and then ultimately up to Hereford, went up through the valley in 1853, 1854, and Ascot got its own station. We've now only got a signal box and a platform. And that was quite helpful in terms of local agriculture, because it did enable produce to be got out of the villages and up to the markets in London. And there's increasing information about the London connections as we research those a little bit more. There had been a school in the village, a dame's school, there were Sunday schools, etc. But in 1871, following Foster's Education Act, the village got its own school. The women that I'm going to talk about shortly, the majority of them could not read. So they make their mark in various places. They had not had the opportunity to learn to read and write. With the arrival of the school, life was going to change for the women and for most of the rest of the families in the village. The other big change that had come about in this area was that a lot of it had been part previously of the Wychwood Forest, royal hunting forest, not dense forests, there were clearings and such like, but quite wooded. And then in the 1850s, the decision had been taken by the Crown, who owned the Wychwood Forest, to deforest and to open up the land for agriculture. It must have had an amazing impact on people living in this area. More so than HS2 going through, more so than the huge expansion that we've seen in the market towns in Oxfordshire in recent years, which have just grown out of all recognition with massive housing estates. But I think for these people, this was a huge change, this sudden sort of opening up. And it's quite interesting looking at census returns to see how employment within the villages changed. That very quickly, anyone associated with woodland, timber, etc., more or less disappears. And it's agriculture. It's not brilliant land, however. So whoever's farming this is not going to make a fast buck. It's hard work. And that's going to put pressure on labourers' wages, because you're going to need to squeeze every penny you can out of this land. The land is, by and large, 7 farms in the village, and they're tenanted. There are 2 smaller privately owned farms, but otherwise they're tenanted. And the farm that we're going to focus on was Crown Farm, which was tenanted to the Crown. So the guy who farmed Crown Farm was a tenant of the Crown estate. So this is Ascot. Just to kind of put you in the mind of, I'm sure you don't need it, but kind of where we are and who we are. 1873. Normally, if I'm doing this in a live audience, I ask people to shout out who they recognise. Queen Victoria, photograph taken in 1873. So she's around and about, as it were. There are lots of lovely stories, and they are only sadly stories in the village, about how Queen Victoria got involved in this incident and handed out red flannel petticoats and goodness knows what to the women involved. Sadly, none of that is true. But we put Queen Victoria up there just as a reminder. And then William Gladstone, Prime Minister, Liberal Prime Minister, in his first term of office. So, Ascot in 1873 then. According to 7 of its tenant farmers, Ascot was a peaceful place until the Union arrived. The Union being the National Agricultural Labourers Union, founded by Joseph Arch, as we know, in 1872, just across the county boundary into South Warwickshire. The Union spread very rapidly during 1872 into the Wychwood villages. It was particularly popular in the Wychwood villages and quickly gained a lot of support. We are told that at this time, Ascot was a place where there was not one distressed family in the village. And with 2 exceptions, the cottages and gardens were good, the rents low, and the allotments close to the village, and conditions generally were above the average for the working man. Robert Hambidge had farmed Crown Farm for 7 years at the time of the incident, apparently without experiencing any problems with his workers. So according to the farmers anyway, all was harmony, sweetness and light in Ascot, and everybody loved everybody else and everybody got on with everybody else and everyone's life was perfect. Since the Union arrived, however, said the farmers, the farm workers had become disrespectful, vexatious and riotous. Well, why? What had gone wrong? Well, apart from anything else, wages, 10 or 12 shillings a week, and obviously with deductions when it rained and work couldn't be done on the land because of the weather, etc., was not enough to sustain a family. And the meagre wages were contributed to by the women who undertook casual field work, but that was uncertain and very poorly paid. The only other alternative occupation for the women was that of gloveress, and of the 16 women involved in the incident, 6 of them described themselves as gloveresses. So they were hand stitching gloves, piece rate, for glove factories in the larger towns in the area. I think at the time there was also issues were coming up around the game laws, which were being, the law of trespass, etc., was being very assiduously applied, and it was difficult to supplement your family food in traditional ways, such as, you know, catching the odd rabbit, etc. So that as well was putting pressure on people. And somebody had been prosecuted for gathering liverwort, to which you had as a tincture, as a sort of cure-all. So, you know, watch out what was going to face you if you went blackberrying. Dread to think. As far as living conditions are concerned, as we said, you know, there is a claim from the farmers that everything is perfect, but as a result of the incident, correspondence from the Daily News and the Times descended on the village, and just as with, you know, an incident like that now, they stuck their noses in everywhere, and some people weren't prepared to talk to them, other people were. Christopher Holloway from the National Agricultural Labourers Union also spent time in the village when the women were released from prison, and between them they provide us with some very detailed descriptions of the homes of agricultural labourers' families. The worst being described by Christopher Holloway, so the union president for the Oxford district. He describes the living conditions of farm labourers' homes as very bad indeed. Imagine a narrow place, like a coal cellar, down which you go 2 or 3 steps, no flooring except broken stones, no ceiling, no grate, so that means no heat, nothing to cook on, rough walls, a bare ladder leading to one narrow bedroom, about 6 feet wide, containing 2 double bedsteads for a man, his wife, and 3 children. And this was the bedroom of Elizabeth Prattley, one of the 16 women imprisoned, and her husband, Eli, their 2 daughters, and their baby son, who was to go into prison with her. The whole place was as wretchedly bad and miserable as imagination can conceive, and only divided by a rough wooden partition, not reaching the roof, but over which you may look into the bedroom of the next adjoining house, equally wretched and miserable. So they were living in what had been the workhouse in the village. Following the reforms and the formation of unions, a large workhouse had been built in Chipping Norton, which is the nearby town. And so generally people entered the workhouse in Chipping Norton. But a local charity had taken over the old workhouse and basically ran it for those who had either been sort of turfed out of everywhere else because they couldn't pay their rent, or because they were possibly at times objectionable in whatever way, but more often because they simply could not afford a rent and they did not want to go into the workhouse in Chipping Norton. So this was one step away from the workhouse. But it was a miserable hovel. Subsequently, it's been demolished. The majority of the housing is the sort of thing that we see here. And sorry, I usually put this in just for people who live more locally, because it is quite amusing in a way to see the left-hand side photograph, which shows the cottages as they were for sort of much of their existence, and how they've all been extended and titivated and such like now, and you know, sell for ridiculous amounts of money. And it's interesting on the left-hand side that the doors, with probably only one exception, around the back. And the local story is that Mrs. Hambidge, Crown Farm farmer's wife, who, looking out of her window, would have the same view as us, didn't like the the workers having their doors at the front, so she could see that the women sat outside, peeling the potatoes or doing whatever they would be doing, stitching the gloves, and insisted that the doors were around the back. But I think that's a little bit of sort of local mythology, and the doors have now all moved around to the front. So conditions were dire for many people. The union, as I say, had by now, Joseph Arch had by now encouraged the development of the union across particularly West Oxfordshire. And the decision was taken to encourage workers to ask for a 2 shilling a week increase come the spring of 1873, because there are certain times of the year in the farming calendar when obviously you need your labourers more desperately than at other times. So if you're going to ask for a pay rise, choose the right time. And the spring is definitely a good time to do this. So on the 12th of April, the labourers on Crown Farm, Saturday the 12th of April, settled with Hambridge their weekly wages as normal, and off they went. Hambridge was known not to be very sympathetic to the union, and when the union had held meetings in the village, he'd been observed standing in the background, noting the names of those who were there, and a suggestion that they were then marked men. So off the men went for their Sunday off, and on the Monday morning, they came back and asked for a 2 shilling a week increase in their wages. They'd targeted Hambridge's farm because it was by far and away the largest in the village at 400 acres. And so that was the place to start. Hambridge eventually agreed, he's desperate, agreed that he would give the most efficient 2 shilling a week increase, but not all. Those he considered through age or infirmity not up to scratch, as it were, he would give them less. And basically the labourers said, well, it's either everybody or it's nobody, and we will withdraw our labour. So they unharnessed the horses, closed the stable door, and off they went, leaving him with several hundred head of sheep, cattle, goodness knows what else, and sowing in need of being done. So it was a desperate time from his point of view. The strike at Crown effectively then spread almost immediately. So it was quite clearly organised, spread almost immediately to the other farms in the village. They followed suit, but the farmers had equally colluded together and agreed that they were not going to pay more than 12 shillings a week, and that they would decide who they would pay it to and who they wouldn't pay it to. So we had, therefore, the sight of a large number of men in the village, as the farmers were later to describe it, idle and insolent. A certain amount of intimidation possibly going on. There was a suggestion that after a couple of days, some of the men wanted to go back to work, but hints had been laid and that they felt they couldn't, it was unsafe to do so. And chants of bar, black legs, etc. Were heard echoing in the village from time to time. The union paid the men strike pay, 9 shillings a week. And then within a couple of weeks, they had found work for about 20 of the men 5 miles away, barking trees, etc., for 2 and 6 a day. And the farmers sort of quite wryly noted that they could have earned more than that, working in the fields, hoeing, etc., closer to home, without the need for a long journey at the beginning and end of each day. So, stalemate. The farmers need the work doing, and therefore they go off seeking non-union labour. Going out of the immediate area, for obvious reasons. And they went, so what provoked this incident was that Robert Hambridge recruited two young lads, John Hodgkins and John Millen, from Ramsden, which is about 5 miles away, to hoe a bean field, which desperately needed doing. The women in the village, wives, daughters, this time almost everybody in the village is related to everybody else in one way or another. So a significant number of women from the village decided that that they weren't having this. This was not on, and that they needed to speak to these two young men, point out the error of their ways, and if possible, persuade them not to go to work in the bean field. So effectively, not to break the strike. The young men were due to start work on the morning of Monday, the 12th of May, and Hambidge set off early up to Stowe Fair, which would have been where he would have met up with other farmers in the area, and doubtless they would have chewed the cud over the problems they were having with their labourers. A few of the women gathered early in the morning and set off out of the village with the aim of meeting the two young lads at the gate into the field and having words with them. Quite what happens next, everybody has a different version of the story. Wherever you look, there's a slightly different version of the story. It seems that ultimately between 20 and 30 women were involved. There were probably also children with them, because what do you do with the kids otherwise? One or two of them may have had sticks. I mean, one of the women involved was 45, 50. If you're an agricultural labourer, female of that sort of age, you're going to have aches and pains. You're probably going to need a stick to help you get about. They also apparently went past the local carpenter, and one of the kids picked up a bit of stick from there. Anyway, the stories vary dramatically. When they got to the bean field, what then happens? Also, all variations on the theme. Undoubtedly, rough words were exchanged. But there were also other things going on as well, because at least two of the young ladies, possibly three, who were involved in this, one of them we think got away with it, 16, 17-year-olds, particularly Fanny Honeybone, who at 16 was the youngest. They, I think, went, as Fanny Honeybone, 1929, was interviewed as an elderly lady. She was the last of the martyrs to die. And she said, oh, we just thought it was a bit of fun, there was nothing malice about it. We were just larking about, etc. And I think those young girls possibly went thinking, ooh, new lads in the village, bit of talent. Let's go and see, let's go and see what's going on. And there was talk at one point of them kind of throwing clods of earth at one another and then offering to help the young lads over the stile, and that led to one of them falling over the stile and something. So you can just see it now, a gang of teenagers together. This is what happens. And then I think at some point the lads thought, oh, wait a minute, this is a bit more serious than we thought, and decided they didn't feel happy about trying to go to work in the field. So they went back to the farm to say that basically they couldn't go to work because the women were preventing them from doing this. Farmer's wife called the constable. The women slowly dispersed, not too keen to go. They had previously offered the young men a drink in the village, if that would persuade them to stop doing what they were doing. But exactly what happened, we don't know. Constable was called, and I say under his supervision, the young lads returned to work hoeing the field, and the women dispersed and thought that was an end of it. And under normal circumstances, I'm sure it would have been. The following day was rent day at the Swan, and that was an opportunity for the farmers to get together. And undoubtedly, this would have been the prime topic of conversation. The agent collecting the rents from the tenant farmers was also the sort of official for the local court. So he was a lawyer. And basically, we think that he probably had a quick word with Hambidge and advised Hambidge that, yes, if he wanted to set an example, he could bring a prosecution against the women. So Hambidge decided to bring a private prosecution under the Criminal Law Amendment Act, basically accusing the women of, through intimidation, preventing the men from going about their lawful business, which under the Criminal Law Amendment Act was illegal. You couldn't chase somebody, you couldn't hide their tools, you couldn't do anything to prevent them going about their work. Women were summoned to appear before the magistrates in Chipping Norton on the 21st of May. We don't know quite how they got there, because Chipping Norton's about 6 miles away, but however, they made it there. They weren't in any way represented. Oops, sorry. Cran Farm. Yeah, Magistrates Court in Chipping Norton. So they weren't in any way represented, partly because I think they just thought they hadn't done anything wrong. And also, where were they going to get the money from to pay for legal representation? The Magistrates Court, the chair of the magistrates, there were 2 of them, 2 clergymen, the Reverend Harris and the Reverend Carter, both relatively local. Carter just near Chipping Norton, and Harris from north of Chipping Norton. Harris, very experienced magistrate. I think he was about 75 at the time of this particular case, so he'd been doing it a long time, knew what he was doing. And basically, the 2 young lads gave their evidence. The women presented 1 witness who said no, they hadn't been carrying sticks, etc., etc. And it just appears that she was ignored. The 2 young lads, as Christopher Holloway, who's chair of the Oxford district of the NALU, Holloway was in court, and he said that it needed all the skills of Hambidge's legal advisor to basically school the young men to get a straight story between them, for any chance of conviction. And basically, it came down to the word of these 2 young lads, 17-year-olds, against the word of 17, mature and respectable ladies. And it was decided to take the word of 2 young men, which, so many people found this absolutely shocking. Under the Criminal Law Amendment Act, they had, having found the women guilty, the junior member of the magistrates, Carter, did query with Hambidge whether he wanted to continue or not, because they knew what the consequences would be, but he insisted. He wanted to make these women made an example of. They could have, they had no option of imposing a fine, which I think is what the women thought. If worst came to worst, they would have had to pay a fine. And we suspect that under those circumstances, the union would have stepped in and paid it for them. But they could equally have been bound over to keep the peace. And this had actually happened in Woodstock, which is about sort of 10 miles south of where we are, the previous year, when there had been a similar sort of incident, and blood, there'd been fisticuffs and blood had been shed. And those concerned were simply bound over to keep the peace, and keep the peace they did. There was no further disturbance. So that obviously worked. Carter did actually, query whether it was necessary to take such a harsh approach, but Harris said, no, this is what the law requires us to do. So they decided not to bind them over, and then believed that the only option, having found them guilty, was to sentence them to imprisonment with hard labour. The law allowed for imprisonment for up to 3 months, with or without hard labour. they consciously chose hard labour. Again, they're really making the most of it. One of the women, they could have imposed shorter sentences than they did, but no. One of the women who had been summoned originally was able to get away, as it were. We don't know her name, because the only way we know the names of the women who were imprisoned is because their names appear on the committal sheet when they were handed over into Oxford jail. So we don't know the name of the woman who was released, because she couldn't be securely identified. We suspect she may have been a relative of one or other of the two young men. So 17 accused, 16 found guilty. 2 of them had babies with them. The 2 Pratley women, Mary and Elizabeth, one had a 10-month-old, the other had a 2-month-old. And under the law as it stood, they went into prison with their mothers. Shock was how this decision was met. There was consequently a riot in Chipping Norton. The police had the women holed up in the cells in the police station, daren't attempt to put them on the train down to the jail or do anything. Police called for reinforcements. And Chipping Norton's actually quite good at rioting. Well, it's still quite good at lesser riots, even now on a Saturday night. And the same cause as now. That's a few too many drinks sometimes. But a huge crowd had gathered. I mean, crowds at this time, you don't know how accurate descriptions are, but possibly upwards of 2,000 people, some of whom I'm sure were there just as observers, others more directly engaged. And they, shouted for the union, they shouted for the women, they threw stones at the police station, broke the tiles on the roof, smashed the windows, partly battered down the door, etc. The poor women inside, I think, must have wondered what on earth was going on. They were squished into 2 small cells and had to take it in turns to sit down. And apparently they kept their spirits up by singing, which, probably attests to their religious backgrounds, I think. Whilst the riot raged outside, police reinforcements were on their way from Oxford. But by the time they arrived, the Riot Act had been read and the pubs had closed and things began to quieten down a little bit, such that by the early hours of the morning, it was possible to take the women and children on a very cold, damp May morning down to Oxford in an open cart. And they arrived at the prison in Oxford about 5 o'clock in the morning. Sadly, although we have the names, and I won't kind of, in a sense, bore you with them, with all their names, if anyone's interested, that they're on our website. But we only have photographs of 2 of the women. Rebecca Smith, 27 at the time, obviously photograph taken in much later life. The coloured detail opposite her is taken from a textile that was created by a group of women in the village and descendants, 2018, in memory of the women, and hangs now in the church. The women on the charge sheet, committal sheet to Oxford, they gave their occupations, and they also gave their religion, their age, etc. So we gain quite a bit of information about them from those documents. But sadly, as I say, only Rebecca Smith and the infamous Fanny Honeybone. As I say, Fanny was the last of the martyrs to die, and she was around to be interviewed in 1928, 1929, and subsequently, because she didn't die until 1939. So she becomes the voice of the story subsequently. And there again, the piece from the textile. And Fanny, like half the other women involved, was a Baptist. half of the women, more or less straight down the middle, were nonconformists, the other half Church of England. So from that point of view, there was no sort of special pleading on religious grounds. The committal sheets survive, fortunately. There's no record of the proceedings, no formal record of the proceedings in the court at all, because it was a private prosecution. So the normal charge sheets and that kind of thing don't exist. So we're reliant on the reports in the newspapers and, as I say, the information on the committal, which gives us the names of the women. And interestingly, I don't know whether you can see, up in the top right-hand corner is the time, 5 AM, which was when they were handed over in Oxford prison, and effectively a receipt for the women. So off they go into jail. And I'll leave you for a moment looking at photographs of Oxford jail. Doesn't look now very much like it did then. They were admitted to the women's wing of the prison, which has subsequently been demolished a number of years ago. There we see a selection of images of Oxford Castle as it is now. It's Malmaison, one of these very posh hotels. And if you stay there now, you can stay in the cells, two of them having been knocked into one. One cell becomes your luxury bathroom, and the one next door is your bedroom for the night. They were, as I say, sentenced to hard labour, and with the exception of the two women who had their babies with them, hard labour meant working in the laundry, which some dismiss as not much work, but it was hot, hard, heavy. You go back to your cell at night with your clothes damp, if not wet. And even though it's May, I can attest to the fact that it's horrible and cold and damp in these cells, the ones that have not been converted into a posh hotel. So you'd be sleeping in damp clothes, etc. And it's hard, heavy work. So the women go into prison. You can't have any communication with anybody in your first month in prison. So whilst they're there, they're going to be there for 7 days with hard labour for those who were seen as part of the gang, as it were, 10 days with hard labour for the 7 who were seen to be the ringleaders. And nobody gets to hear a word from them. So what happens then in the outside world? Well, kind of all hell lets loose. The first anybody other than anybody in Chipping Norton knows about it is on Friday the 23rd. So the Wednesday is the trial, the Friday the 23rd is publication of the Times, and in that, under the banner "Impossible," is a letter pinned by Christopher Holloway describing what had happened in court and how outrageous it was that these women had been imprisoned with hard labour for a crime whose existence they were not even aware of, and on the word of two callow youths, as it were. And the word of these sort of 16, 17 upright women had been completely ignored. By the Monday, so that's the Friday, by the Monday, and I think this is where the National Agricultural Labourers Union began to rally some of its supporters, who were men of significance, MPs, etc. Questions started to be asked in the House of Commons from Bruce, the Home Secretary, about the magistrates. Was this right, that this was the decision they had reached? Had he questioned them as to why? Did he have an answer, etc.? And that argument ran on for several weeks and resulted in letters from the Home Secretary to the magistrates, and then he having failed to get much response out of them, other than they stuck by this decision they had made. It was then referred to the Lord Chancellor, and Selborne wrote to the Duke of Marlborough, who was the Lord Lieutenant responsible for magistrates, expressing his disquiet at what he had heard and giving it as his opinion that the magistrates had made a mistake. The Duke of Marlborough comes back and says, well, I don't think they did. I think they did the right thing. You know, he's a landowner. He's going to go with this decision, which is obviously designed as an example to others. So that's rumbling on. It's all getting really good press coverage for the union as well, because the union are very much involved in these questions, these discussions, these letters to the press, etc. And almost every day we have new information, new queries, new questions, new letters. Eventually, whilst they say, oh, this is ticking along, and the magistrates are called into question as to whether as clergymen they can be magistrates, because how on earth can you equate being a clergyman and caring for your flock, etc., with having to undertake the kind of activities that these two magistrates have just undertaken. So it gives fuel to the demand for an end to clerical magistrates, etc. 7 days after they went into prison, the women are released. The first lot of women are released on the 28th. And they went home by train. It's a lovely description of their sort of journey home. And they went up to Chipping Norton, so they went on the train through Ascot because it was the 12 o'clock express, which didn't stop. And apparently as it went through the village, there were all these little children. So the press describe it standing waving at their mothers, and one railway carriage window was full of handkerchiefs waving back in the opposite direction. And it was kind of, oh, there's mum, oh, she's gone again. Because they had to go up to Chipping Norton Junction and wait for the stopping train an hour later to bring them back down the line and home. So they were released. There was a large police presence at the station because they anticipated trouble. There wasn't any. And apparently the superintendent of police is described as standing, you can imagine him almost with his arms folded behind his back, kind of whistling into the air and taking inordinate interest in a rook's nest in one of the trees near the station. He was obviously slightly embarrassed at having to be there. In the meantime, the questions from the Home Secretary to the magistrates and the responses that he had elicited from them, as I say, left him with the feeling that they had definitely overstepped the mark, and that certainly to apply hard labour to the sentence was beyond what was called for. So a telegram was sent as soon as he got the response back from the magistrates. The telegram was sent, which didn't reach the prison until the day after the 7-day women had been released, but at least it improved matters for the 10-day women, that they no longer had to engage in hard labour. So the 10-day women were released on the 31st of May, and the union had organised things such that by the time they were released, the press were there. There was a crowd of about 150, 200 people outside the prison to meet them, greet them. There were sort of cries of shame and mutterings, etc. But overwhelmingly, the crowd were in favour of the women. And somebody shouted out, "They're martyrs to a good cause." And that met with considerable approval. And subsequently, there were other references to them being martyrs to a good cause, hence the title Ascott Martyrs. So nobody died, but they certainly were ill-treated, and as a result of that, shone a light on events in the village and elsewhere. Great journey home, or at least by open carriage up to Chipping Norton, stopping in all the villages on the way and being cheered and etc. Got to Chipping Norton in the evening, crowd of 2,000 or 3,000 had gathered. And Joseph Arch was there to speak, together with other union officials, to condemn the Criminal Law Amendment Act yet again that sent innocent women and children to prison, etc., and calling for stipendiary magistrates. He also, possibly for the first time, began to talk about an extension of the franchise and how that was the only way that the working man would ever feel he was could be justly dealt with. In the weeks that followed, light continued to be shone on the village because the press were not going to let this go. They'd got a stick with which to beat Gladstone's government, and they were going to use it. So we get more and more detailed reports. Once the women are home from prison, there are interviews with them, so there's more opportunity for them to give more detail as to what they think had happened on that day and how innocent they were, for the press to show how these were upright, sort of lower middle class women, etc., and to question whether, had there been clergymen's wives involved in this, the Home Secretary would have acted more swiftly and more decisively to bring the whole thing to an end. There were also further arguments around the conditions experienced by the nursing mothers in prison, and that again led to exchanges between Mackenzie, who was a barrister and supporter of the Agricultural Labourers Union. He wrote to the Times and gave considerable detail as to how these women had been treated. Amazingly, in comparison to what would happen these days, the letter sort of hit the Times on the Thursday. On the Friday, the prison authorities were asked to investigate. They called the investigation on Saturday morning, and on the Monday morning, a report was given to the House of Commons, which showed that actually the women had been treated according to the rules. So Mackenzie questioned the rules. The whole thing finally, sort of as far as the women were concerned, came to an end on the 20th of June with a party in the village, to which Arch, Holloway, Leggett, Banbury, and many others, including labourers and wives and families from the surrounding villages, turned up. So a huge crowd gathered, and there was a bit of a funfair on the village green. The union officials arrived by train, and they were sort of clapped all the way from the station. The women had been provided with blue dresses, new blue dresses and matching headgear by the union. And in turn, each of them came up onto an open wagon in the middle of the village to receive £5, which had been gathered by the union from public subscription. And as far as the women were concerned, really, that was then the end of it. What did they do? We don't know. We know that in the village things rumbled on because there were still arrests at a union meeting in the village a month later. We don't know the fate of the men because we don't know their names. So we don't know what happened to them subsequently. For the women, we know that Elizabeth Prattley and baby Eli and the rest of the family emigrated to Canada, sailing out of Portsmouth on the 14th of July for Canada. There's a whole other story there, but they were gone. On the 21st of September, the school logbook records that 11 children left the village to go to New Zealand. And in October, Amelia Moss, her family, another one of the martyrs, left the village. And then a few weeks later, Anne Moss and her family, who eventually ended up in Mississippi, left the village. So there was an exodus of martyrs and others following this incident, which again was reflected across the villages in West Oxfordshire in 1873. This was, the real push towards saying, right, we've had it with this country. We've had it with farming here and working here. We'll look for a new life, go somewhere else. John Banbury, who was part of the Oxfordshire Union, spoke at a big trades union meeting on the Whit Monday, the beginning of June in London. And he again explained what had happened to the women and spoke against the Criminal Law Amendment Act, etc. And he said that the women had done more to further the repeal of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which made peaceful picketing legal, than all the talking in the world. So that was his view as to what they had achieved. What the women had achieved for themselves was £5 and a new blue dress and a hat, which can't be bad. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. That's a very full picture you've given us there. Oh, well, here's the grave of Hambidge, and sometimes mistakenly called Hambridge, but it is actually Hambidge.
It is Hambidge.
Yeah. I know. It's very interesting. If you've got a question, if people would like to come in and ask you a question, that'd be fantastic. Anyone there wish to ask a question? Kate Pierce, do you want to come in, Kate? Do you want to unmute yourself? You there, Kate? I can't. Oh, here we are, boy. Kate.
Sorry, it's my fault. Just a moment. I need to change one of the settings so that she can unmute.
Okay. Not allowed to unmute. They're very good. Yeah, this is very draconian, isn't it? We're not allowing people to unmute now.
Yeah, because we're a democratic organization. Bear with.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. It should be able to work now.
Okay, Kate.
Hear me now, yeah. Thanks, Carol. Very interesting. I've got two questions actually. The first is this story isn't very well known.
No.
I remember at primary school being taught about it.
Ah.
And that would have been in the 70s. But then I grew up to the west of Oxford, and it was local as well.
Yes, and it would have been about the time then of the 100th anniversary. Yeah. And locally, a lot was made of the 100th anniversary. And there wasn't time this evening, but there was a tree was planted on the green, the classic horse chestnut, seats put around it with the names of the martyrs on, etc. So, and there was a school teacher at Kingham Hill School who was very interested in it.
So my question was, it's sort of linked to the title of your organisation as well, as an educational trust. How can we tell people about this, apart from those that know, just talking to small groups? I mean, and I suppose I'd like to see a celebration of some sort, and next year being the 100th year, 150th year, I think that would be actually appropriate and important. So that's sort of two questions.
Yeah, well, and the answer to both is yes, yes. We're only, I say, quite a small group, and we are all based in the village. But what we are planning next year, a celebration to mark the event. It's not going to be huge because we just don't have the resource, human or financial, to make it huge. But we are working also on ways of getting the word out in various different ways. Working with a group called 3 Acres and a Cow. Do you know 3 Acres and a Cow? Yeah, they're going to include a sort of chapter in their performance next year, which they will take around the country, which will tell the martyrs' story. So that's great, a way of getting it out. There is a book which was written 3-4 years ago now by Beverly McCombs, who is a descendant of Elizabeth Prattley. Beverly lives in New Zealand, so and I think, strangely enough, there's probably more known about this in New Zealand than there is in Oxfordshire. So we are sort of trying to get the word out. We are giving talks which until now have been mainly local in Oxfordshire, but it would be great, to be able to get out beyond Oxfordshire and talk to other groups and more widely about this. There will also be a new book coming out to coincide with International Women's Day next March, and possibly a conference. The contributors to the book, the central sort of theme of the book being what happened, and then experts looking at all the various aspects of what happened. And that, I think, may form the basis of a conference to be held in what was one of the farms in the village, but has now been converted into an environmental education centre, and it's got fantastic views over the parish, as it were.
You've been invited to the top of the Radical History School.
Yeah.
Next July, yeah. So
yeah.
we're going to have you there.
So word is getting. But if anybody's got any good ideas, then please do get in touch with us.
The radical tea towel idea is quite a nice idea. Rosie, can I take your question?
Yeah, actually, I've got a couple as well, I'm afraid.
That's okay.
Firstly, there was a kind of throwaway line there about what happened to the family who went to Canada, and I just wondered if you knew how their lives progressed.
Oh, it's really sad. Sometimes I can't bring myself to talk about it if I'm giving a talk, because it upsets me. But basically, Elizabeth Brackley, who had the Eli, who was 2 months old when she went into prison, and he was, she was breastfeeding. Her breast milk dried up as a result of going into prison. I think just the shock and everything, probably. And obviously, it was a week, but the baby was provided with some milk and such like else, but I'm sure it caught a chill and so on and so forth. So it wasn't well, and neither was she. They came home, and as I say, on the 14th of July, they were on ship and off. I haven't yet been able to find out, and I'd be interested if anybody else kind of can help, when they would have booked their passage. I'm intrigued to know whether they'd already booked to leave before the incident, or whether that was the deciding factor and the £5 gave them the money to go. I don't know.
Yeah.
But they went to Canada, and sadly, not long after they'd arrived, she contracted typhus, as did the baby, and died. Husband came back again, bringing their clothes, and of course brought the bacteria back with him. And I think it was mother-in-law who died as well. Anyway, nothing deterred. He remarried after not too long a period, and set off again, this time for New Zealand, where he fared much better. And eventually ended up owning his own farm. And Beverly, who wrote the book, is descended from that second family. So
Holloway, sorry. Go on.
Go on.
I was going to say Holloway, the guy who's we've talked about this evening,
Holloway,
became an agent for the government of New Zealand to encourage people to emigrate. So basically, he stopped being a trade union leader and became an immigration agent at a much higher salary.
I was just going to say much better paid.
Yeah. Do you have a second question, Rosie?
Yes, it's about the Crown Estates, which took a very long time to change their ways in all sorts of ways. I was just wondering if there were any consequences in terms of the Crown Estates, or in terms of the name of the farmer who brought the private prosecution.
No, I mean, the Hambidges continued to farm Crown Farm until the 1930s. So they stayed. Robert Hambidge was local-ish, came from Ickham. He was a tenant farmer up that way, and obviously then came to Crown because it was a bigger farm, and took over the tenancy from the previous farmer who was the first tenant after deforestation, and for some reason didn't stay very long. That's a mystery I'm still working on. But yeah, I mean, Hambridge, so he'd been there 6 years or so, 6-7 years when the incident happened. And things just seem to go on as normal. I mean, he employed, subsequently, we know from census returns that he employed, a couple of daughters of martyrs as servants in the house and such like.
He was quite litigious, wasn't he? Wasn't he quite litigious? Didn't he have a history of private prosecutions before this one?
I think they all were, though. I mean, he took his carter when the union men gave notice. His carter, who would have been, because he looked after the horses, would have been on a sort of annual contract and would have been and was better paid. He decided that he would assume kind of solidarity with his fellow workers and came out on strike on the same day as them. But he hadn't given the week's notice, which the Master and Servant Act required him to do. And so Hambridge took him to court for that. And he was fined costs, which were quite hefty. Hambridge, there's other incidents as well. But then if you look at the previous farmer, he's barely got his feet under the table when he's taking somebody to court, because basically they pinched a lot of young hawthorn spurs that he was quite clearly hedging following clearance of the land, and somebody had nicked all his hedging plants. I don't think he was necessarily any more litigious than any of the others, but because he owned by far and away the biggest farm, he would definitely have been seen as kind of the senior partner in the village, as it were, and to set an example.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's been a really, really interesting talk. I think it's been a hidden subject for far too long. I know the book's coming out next year. I'm sure the 150th celebration will go well. I see that Michael's wishing you solidarity with all the strikers. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the Tolpuddle Radical History School. We'll sort an invitation out when we start to organise that in October.
Fantastic.
And once again, just to say thank you very, very much, and to wish you the best of luck with your celebrations for next year. And thank you to all of you for turning up. 22 of you turn up tonight. That's an absolutely brilliant outcome, and it's been wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for turning up. Okay, good night. Have a very good evening. Thank you, Carol. Bye-bye.